Buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos a este seminario interdisciplinario de estudios de prensa y poder del CIDE, de nuestro programa de periodismo del CIDE. Estamos pues muy contentas porque este es el evento pues especial de nuestro semestre, de nuestro seminario, con la presencia de la doctora Julie Posetti. Presento yo soy Yennué Zárate Valderrama, profesora asociada de PeriodismoCIDE. Esto es para ustedes y para dialogar en conjunto sobre pues, la violencia hacia las mujeres periodistas. Voy a presentar a la doctora Julie Posetti. Ella es directora de investigación global del Centro Internacional para Periodistas, el conocido por ICFJ, y es investigadora también senior en la Universidad de Sheffield, en el Reino Unido, y también es investigadora asociada del Instituto Reuters de Estudios del Periodismo en Oxford, donde ella vive y trabaja, ¿no? Ella es doctora en estudios de periodismo, especialista en privacidad y derechos digitales, investiga seguridad de periodistas, género y medios, desinformación, y últimamente están realizando con el Centro Internacional de Periodistas una investigación sobre COVID y precariedad laboral. Y bueno, ella antes de ser académica fue periodista, ¿no?, de La Fuente Política y editora de varios medios, entre ellos de Sydney Morning Herald y de Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Y pues estamos felices de tenerla aquí y bienvenida, Julie. El micrófono es tuyo.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that kind welcome. Now, I'm currently getting the Spanish translation in my ear. No, it's stopped. That's good. Because not only can I not think in English and Spanish simultaneously, but I don't speak Spanish beyond being able to order some sort of restaurant food, which is very, very sad, I'm sorry to say. But I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. And I am certainly no expert on Mexico or the situation facing journalists in Mexico, but I know enough to know that I am in serious solidarity with journalists in Mexico, and also in particular women journalists, knowing as I do something about the rates of femicide and impunity when it comes to journalists. So I admire what you do in terms of your research, and for the journalists in the room, your tenacity. I admire immensely. Sorry, I just took over your microphone there, but you just tell me when you would like me to continue.
This is your time.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Start now or whatever you want.
Yes, no, I think now is a good time to start. So today I'm going to present to you some research which we continue to produce for UNESCO. I have a presentation, but I'll be speaking relatively extemporaneously, so you can follow along. I'm quite happy to take questions. If people have something urgent they want to ask, I'm fine with disruptions, so feel free to put up your hand, but I know we will also have an opportunity for conversation and formal questions at the end of this presentation. So just bear with me while I try to share my screen. This is always one of those awkward Zoom moments. So here we are. And present. Okay. So just let me know too if there are any technical issues with the slides as we go through, but I'm assuming you can all see this now. Yes, excellent. So this presentation that I'm delivering today is about the study that we at ICFJ have produced in collaboration with 20 international researchers and journalists working in 15 countries around the world. It's a very large project. It's been quite complex to try to manage, particularly given we're doing what is pretty cutting edge research for a very large intergovernmental organization that is part of the UN infrastructure. So you can imagine, I'm sure, the kinds of challenges that accompany that. So we began this project into online violence against women journalists in about December 2019. And just as we were about to commence field work, the pandemic hit. So unfortunately, rather than spending months in the field in the 15 countries that we've chosen to study in detail and to conduct interviews with specific sets of journalists around the world, we of course had to pivot to this kind of interaction. And I'm happy to talk with you about the implications for source sensitivity or research subject sensitivity connected to this kind of work using these methods, but also just the general difficulties of trying to do a project at this scale remotely. I'm happy to answer questions about that in the conversation afterwards. But I'd like to focus on one of the key themes that's emerged from this study, and that is the intersection of hate speech, particularly misogynistic hate speech, and disinformation when it comes to dealing with questions of online violence against women journalists. This is a trend we've noted internationally, and that's the theme of the presentation today. The hashtag for the actual project is Journalists2, which is what UNESCO has been using for a couple of years now in connection with their work. And World Press Freedom Day 2021 is there as a legacy hashtag, because that's when we launched this report that you see on the screen now. And just to give you a bit more context before I start running you through the slides, we began the project, as I said, with some major desk research in December 2019, and that continued for the early part of 2020. And we were in that process doing, an assessment of existing initiatives to try to respond to online violence, because UNESCO's initial objective was to try to find examples of effective solutions to this crisis. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you that that was probably somewhat premature as an ambition, because this is a crisis that keeps getting worse. And there is no such thing as an identifiable effective solution. So what we've ended up doing is really trying to map the field in a genuinely international way, which will allow us to have new insights into the incidents and impacts of online violence on women journalists, not just in the developed West, which is what most other studies have focused on in regard to this theme, but specifically and especially in the global South. And to that end, we started with a global survey of journalists, specifically targeting women journalists. And I'll present some of the data from that survey, but I'll just start by giving you some insights into what we did and how we did it. And I think for an academic audience, which you essentially are, some of this will be highly relevant to your own research. So one of the first decisions we had to make with the necessity to do an online survey was how to prevent a survey on gender-based violence against women journalists in digital contexts, how to prevent it from being weaponized and trolled in and of itself. And so given that we needed to attract a sample at scale in multiple languages, but we wanted to ensure that we were making this a user-friendly opportunity for journalists who have such limited time and in the context of the pandemic were genuinely struggling just to survive, let alone deal with another survey about their lived experience. So we chose to use partner organizations, so civil society organizations, news organizations, and UNESCO's own training and media development programs internationally to field the survey. We kept it off the social web, we kept it off publicly accessible links. So there was a several step process involved in people getting access to the survey. So this was an attempt at quality control, but most importantly, an attempt at protecting digital security based attacks on the survey, which is something that I've recently experienced in reference to another research project, and I'm happy to talk about that later. So we fielded this survey through those networks, and we attracted over 900 respondents whose contributions we vetted by virtue of checking their validity in terms of the answers that they were giving. And of those 900, around 83% were women. So we're looking at around 714, I think is the figure, women who were surveyed around the world. And we had women from 125 countries responding. And Mexico was, in fact, one of the top 10 countries in the mix in terms of those survey results. So what we found as a result of surveying these women were particular trends which are connected to this nexus between hatred and disinformation, which I'll take us through in a moment. But before we got to this report published on World Press Freedom Day called The Chilling, which has had a pretty extraordinary reaction from the media internationally, actually. But prior to that, in December, we published a global snapshot presenting the data, the top-level data from the survey. With The Chilling, we have combined the survey data and we've done a degree of disaggregation to try to get an understanding around intersectional threats, for example. But we also incorporated the insights from an analysis of 173 long-form interviews that were done with journalists and experts within the law and privacy and NGOs. So that's the data set that we're working with for The Chilling. And as I said, the insights of experts from 16 countries who are behind the research. So I'm just going to advance the slide. Here we are. So there are several insights I could share immediately, but the first and probably most obvious is this, that in combination with threats that are escalating at the intersection of misogyny and disinformation, the demonization of journalism, and the impacts of the pandemic, we see that women journalists are now more exposed to online violence than they have ever been. And I'm referring to this as the new front line of journalism safety, where women journalists really sit at the epicenter of risk. The converging risks include this spectre of disinformation and its various tactics, but also digital security threats, along with the significant and sometimes debilitating impacts of prolonged or at-scale online violence. And this is a quote on the right, my right of screen, I'm not sure where you're seeing it there, from the UN Secretary General. And he tweeted this a few months ago now, at the beginning of the year. And to see the UN Secretary General tweeting, there should be no room for misogyny and violence in journalism, and social media platforms and governments must protect women journalists from online violence. Specifically in connection with this research, that tweet was shared, was pretty empowering, I have to say. I think, you know, when the Secretary General of the UN is actually sitting up and taking notice, or at least his staff are, then you have an issue that's firmly on the international agenda for action, as this well should be. So before I go any further, I just want to talk about the term online violence and why we've chosen to use that term explicitly. And there was significant debate about whether we should in fact use this term and whether it would be more appropriate to save the word violence for episodes of physical violence against journalists. And this is a term that has actually been used not just by feminists and scholars and NGOs, but also by the UN previously. But we did come up against some opposition to the term, and on the grounds that we should not conflate violence, for example, of a psychological or digital kind, with physical violence. And while I acknowledge that there are distinctions, we argued very strongly that in the same way that the use of language has been really important in terms of mobilizing and galvanizing feminists and allies internationally in reference to femicide and violence against women more broadly, it has been also very important in the context of challenging what we call in English domestic violence. I'm not sure what term you apply in the Mexican context to violence in the home against women, but certainly in our context, domestic violence is now understood as being far more widely ranging than simply physical violence. It includes psychological violence, gaslighting, is now incorporated in the concept, economic violence, and a whole range of other manifestations to do with social isolation that are designed to intimidate and isolate women. And so we saw very similar manifestations in the context of online violence against women journalists, but more broadly against women. And we felt it was important to name what we saw in that framing. And I have to say that it's one of the features of this work that has caused people, especially men, to sit up and take notice, some because they want to argue about the terminology, but certainly others who, when confronted with the large data sets that we also present in this study, which I'll come to in a moment, and the visceral nature of some of the hateful language, along with the serious physical threats that are leveled against the women who are targeted. I think it's been an effective decision, but we can discuss that further if you like as we go through. Sorry, I don't know what I'm doing with my screen there. I'm just going to try and minimize. There we are. So we did, as I said, 173 research interviews. We surveyed 901 journalists, 714 of whom were women. And among our key findings were the fact that threats at the intersection of misogyny and sexism, and then other forms of discrimination, in particular racism, homophobia and transphobia, religious bigotry and sectarianism, ableism, for example. These intersectional factors certainly increased both the risk of exposure that the women faced, the women journalists faced, along with worse impacts of online violence. And they included the second key trend, which is that online violence is moving offline in ways that we have not previously identified, and at least not at scale. So what we're seeing there is not just, and I say just without wanting to minimize the impacts of this terror, but in addition to threats of physical violence in the form of, say, a stalker who is threatening rape, actually manifesting in a physical sense with assaults taking place, we're also talking about the ways in which online violence against women journalists is a new tool in the arsenal of repressive states, where they are using targeted attacks against journalists to create a kind of artificial consensus for the persecution of those journalists offline. So that can trigger mob-related violence. it can also trigger legal harassment. And so we can make connections, for example, between Maria Ressa in the Philippines and Carol Cadwallader in the UK, who are the subjects of two of the big data case studies we did for this report and for the forthcoming book, where we can actually see a trajectory from the online assaults to the ramping up of the legal harassment. We'll unpack that a bit later. And then this idea of disinformation as a multi-pronged and intersecting threat upon those other layers of intersectional risk. So disinformation, I don't have to tell you, is a feature of, or networked disinformation is a feature of the populist political landscape we occupy internationally. I mean, the tilt to the right towards fascism is not something that's restricted to the global south, as Donald Trump so well demonstrated. And I think that's one of the things that we were able to really note through this research, that it's a problem that is affecting women from New York to Manila, from Mexico City to Sydney. This is a problem that, certainly affects women on the continent of Africa and within the Arab states as well. It's a global phenomenon, but one of the aspects that stands out is the function of disinformation, both as a set of tactics. So misogynistic attacks are used by disinformation actors as a way of trying to discredit women journalists with a view to chilling their reporting. So those disinformation tactics can include the misrepresentation of women journalists, for example, but reporting on disinformation, which is increasingly an important beat within journalism internationally, particularly in the context of COVID, is another kind of lightning rod for such attacks. So reporting on disinformation makes you more vulnerable. Disinformation tactics are used by misogynists in trying to shut women up, and then disinformation purveyors use misogynistic hate speech to enhance the virality of their disinformation. Okay, so we also produced two big data case studies, which I'll get to towards the end of this presentation, but they involved analysing the data of Twitter and Facebook, focused on Maria Ressa and Carol Cadwallader, and we looked at 2.5 million in the end social media posts to do this analysis. And that was produced with some exceptionally talented feminist women computer scientists who are also linguists at the Centre for Freedom of the Media at the University of Sheffield, Kalina Boncheva and Diana Maynard, and I want to give them super credit for their amazing and tireless work with me on this project. We also did 15 country case studies, which are currently being finalised. And let me take you through those countries, and I hope I don't miss any out. I feel like I could recite them in my sleep now, but let's start with Asia. So we looked at the Philippines, we looked at Sri Lanka, and we looked at Pakistan. Then if we move to Africa, we looked at South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. And in the Arab states, we looked at Tunisia and Lebanon. In Latin America, Mexico, and also Brazil. And in Europe and North America, we've studied the United States, Sweden, and the UK. And I think I'm leaving off a subset of countries. Yes, I am. Eastern Europe. So we looked at Serbia and Poland there. And I think that should add up to 15 country case studies. So some of the other key findings, which I'll run you through as well, were the role not just of disinformation, but political extremism, and particularly far-right extremism. And we saw that intersecting as well with online conspiracy networks. So all of this bound up, particularly in the context of the pandemic, has created an increasing risk of online violence facing women journalists. In fact, just to bring in a piece of data from a parallel study we've been running with the Tao Center at Columbia University in the US. We found that approximately 20% of our respondents said that online violence during the pandemic, during the first wave of the pandemic, had been much worse than prior to the pandemic. So we're now accumulating data that creates a pretty sad picture on that score. And this again will come as no shock, but the platforms are clearly the main vectors, the main enablers, the main facilitators of online violence for facing women journalists. The platforms, in terms of their role, differ around the world. So, for example, in the Philippines, Facebook is the main site of the abuse experienced by journalists. It's utterly dominant there as platforms go. In South Africa, for example, it is Twitter. And in some of the South Asian countries, YouTube is the site of some of the worst abuse that's experienced. So while the location, the digital location might change, the functionality remains the same. The other thing that we're seeing, of course, is the abuse jumping from platform to platform. And certainly in the case of the United States, we saw evidence of swarms being organized to target women journalists in what misogynists refer to as dogpiling, which I found particularly venal as a concept. So that's just to give you some insights into the function of the platforms. And one of the key problems that we face here is that up until probably 2 or 3 years ago, most scholars and journalists and civil society actors working in this space looked to news organizations to try to respond to online violence through defensive training and through other digital security measures, policies and guidelines. And they tended to focus on what they could control, which was comments below the line on their websites. So news website comments. But of course, what we find now in 2020, 2021, is that most of the abuse that's being experienced is not happening within those comments, although it certainly still does. And those comments can be much more easily moderated by news organizations. And a lot of good work has been done in that regard. They cannot, the editors, the newsroom managers, they cannot effect the sort of change that's required on the platforms. And so that's why it's so important to focus on these giant social media companies that are almost exclusively based in the US. So the function of political actors as attackers, right from Donald Trump in the US to Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines, and we can add any number of, frankly, male, sexist and generally speaking populist political leaders to that mix. But politicians, elected officials, political party members and donors are an increasing site of actors for instigating and fueling online attacks. We've also seen the instrumentalization of partisan media, which is something that is really quite disturbing. And a classic example of that actually occurs in the US context, where we will see attacks seeded on Twitter, for example, against prominent feminist writers such as Taylor Lorenz at the New York Times, who writes about internet culture. We'll see the misogynists begin the campaign. Then we will see sexist journalists from particular outlets amplifying the abuse that they're experiencing and dog whistling, so calling on other attackers. And then we see those abusive acts moving off Twitter and other social media platforms through to Tucker Carlson's Fox News TV show, his nightly TV show, as an arch-conservative commentator who then whistles to his audience to pile on. So his typically, older, less technologically savvy, but nevertheless willing to be manipulated audience of respondents, and they join the fray. And as I mentioned before, news organizations are not just struggling to respond effectively. In some cases, they're responding destructively. And we saw a trend playing out particularly in places like the US and the UK, where one of the methods being used to try to deal with the problem is actually to silence the women, to punish them for speaking up, for preventing them from commentating on controversial issues. Many of these attempts really do have victim blaming mentality attached to them. We had situations facing a number of journalists in the US who had either been disciplined or one of whom had actually been sacked for daring to engage with her trolls in the midst of an attack because she allegedly brought the news organization into disrepute, a very large, reputable news organization. Okay, so we can unpack some more of the key findings in the conversation later. Can somebody just tell me how long I've been talking and how much longer I have? I've got 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's you started at 11:07 and it's 11:34, so you're very good.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, 10-15 minutes, no problem.
Great. All right, so let's have a look at some of the data regarding the intersectional experience of online violence. So these figures should be compared to the global data point that we first published in December based on our survey. So we had 73% of women journalists internationally based on the global aggregated responses of women journalists to that survey. 73% was the figure at the global level. When we broke it down, we were able to see comparisons that indicate that if you're a white heterosexual woman, for example, you're less likely to be attacked, unsurprisingly, than if you're a Black woman journalist, or an Indigenous woman journalist, a Jewish woman journalist, and in terms of gender, sexual orientation, bisexual and lesbian women journalists also were much more likely to experience online violence. And I just went through the data, which we haven't published yet, around women who identified as Latinx, so Latino or Hispanic, and I apologize if I'm using terminology that is not considered appropriate, and you can educate me about that. But for women who identified as either Latino or Hispanic, the figure was 77%, so certainly higher than the white women, as you would expect, because of the intersectional discriminatory factors in play there. We also found, though, interestingly, that when we broke down the data, and again, this hasn't been published yet, but on a regional level, the figure was actually remarkably similar to the global figure for the experience of online violence in Latin America. It was 73%, in fact. And if we move to this next slide, one of those key trends, which is super disturbing, is this feature of online violence that sees it moving offline. So 20% of all of the women we surveyed internationally said that they had experienced offline attacks that they believed had been seeded online. That figure jumps substantially to 53% when we look at the Arab women respondents, which was quite a startling figure. And in the case of Latin America, the figure was actually quite close to the 20% at the international level. But we see distinctions in different contexts. And that's the one piece of data that did quite surprise me, given that we pushed the survey hard in places like Mexico and Brazil, where we know that there have been some really serious cases of offline violence being connected with online attacks. But hopefully, as we finalize the analysis of the interviews that we've done for that region, your region, that will become clearer. So that's the offline versus online. I just want to go and, sorry, I'm going to try and go back to this slide for a moment, take you through some of the other data where we had some kind of indications that there were points of difference in Latin America compared to, say, for example, the global community's experience as per this survey's limited ability to illustrate that. So we had, referring back to the role of political actors, for example, as instigators of online violence, globally that figure was 37%, so 37% of the women we surveyed said that political actors were the top instigators or offenders when it came to online violence that they were experiencing. In Latin America, that figure jumped to 45%. So a further uptick there. Okay, so we've covered this a little already, so I won't spend too much time on it, but this threefold function of disinformation and the way in which it's tied up with issues connected to conspiracy networks and far-right extremism, the way in which misogynistic abuse is deployed in disinformation operations to shut women up. We saw examples of that from all over the world. A particularly hideous case involves Ghada Ouess, who's a Lebanese journalist who is the lead presenter in Arabic on Al Jazeera. And she had such a significant period of attack, which continues actually at such a scale that she has taken legal action in a US court to try to get those attacking her, who she's actually named as a range of different officials connected to Saudi Arabia. And she's taken legal action partly in response to the ways in which disinformation was being used to discredit her in the context of these attacks, designed to not just belittle her, but to suggest, for example, that she was a prostitute, which is a common form of abuse that women face. But with that kind of allegation being made that you're a porn star or a prostitute, for example, in the context of the Arab states environment, that's extremely problematic. And again, the way in which misogyny is leveraging disinformation tactics in a multi-platform context. So men gathering, or identifiably men gathering in chat rooms and on various servers to plot the ways in which they will attack women journalists and what rumors they will spread about them, for example. So here we get to the big data case studies involving Maria Ressa and Carol Cadwallader. And as I said, 2.5 million social media posts were examined. And one of the key findings from the survey data was very much illustrated in the analysis that we produced on both of these high-profile journalists. So we found internationally that 41% of those survey respondents said they'd been attacked online as part of what they believed to be a disinformation campaign. So you can see the data building. And so just let me take a glass of water for a moment. What Maria Ressa experienced and continues to experience in the Philippines, where since 2016 she has been the target of prolific, hideous online violence, which is a feature of the enabling environment, if you like, for her prosecution and persecution and conviction in the Philippines. And we can't directly compare her case to that of Carol Cadwallader. We can see some similarities. So for those of you who don't know, Maria is a really prominent former CNN foreign correspondent who founded the news website Rappler in Manila back in 2011. And it was actually a Facebook-born news organization, if you like. They began publishing on Facebook before they evolved into a news website. Now she's probably one of the strongest critics of Facebook internationally. And the reason for that is because she holds Facebook accountable, not just for the scourge of online violence against women journalists, but also for viral disinformation. And these two trends she sees in combination as having really destabilized democracy in the Philippines. Carol Cadwallader is the extraordinary investigative reporter and columnist from The Guardian and Observer in the UK, who broke the story that broke Cambridge Analytica as a company that caused Cambridge Analytica to collapse and that caused the biggest scandal in Facebook's history to date. That is, if you discount the role that they played in the Myanmar genocide. But the biggest fines in the history of communications regulators in both the US and in the UK were handed to Facebook in the context of this scandal. And of course, the scandal was linked to two of the most polarizing episodes in recent Western liberal democratic history. And that was the election of Donald Trump in the US and the so-called Brexit referendum in the UK about the UK leaving the EU. So these case studies have similarities that are worth unpacking, connected to the political polarization that these societies are experiencing, the rise of populism, the rise of the misogynistic strong man around the world as well. What we found in their cases was that they were both being attacked for being journalists in the first instance, and secondly, because they were women. So the misogynistic nature of the abuse, when we analysed it using a combination of natural language processing techniques applied to the language that was being deployed against these women, we found that misogyny was the top driving feature, if you like, behind the attacks. But we also found in the case of Maria, for example, that racism was in play, as was homophobia. So she was attacked for the color of her skin. She was attacked because on the basis of the abusers asking questions about her sexuality. She was attacked not only for these reasons, but also because of a skin condition she has. So there was a degree of ableisms, discrimination on the basis of a physical condition. With Carol, she really is a victim of what we call networked gaslighting. She was ridiculed, she was humiliated, she was made to feel utterly discredited. She started to, she says she started to question her own reality. She started to feel the mental health effects of this constant barrage of niggling and at times highly abusive attacks on her. One episode that she experienced involved a deep fake video where there was a scene taken from a historic film which involved a woman being slapped repeatedly by men, one of whom held a gun, one of whom held a bat, and she had her head had been superimposed onto the body of the woman being assaulted, and that she still finds really difficult to kind of comprehend because of the way it left her feeling and the effect it had on her willingness to continue to speak truth to power in the context of these very big stories involving very powerful actors. And while Maria Ressa has, of course, been convicted on a trumped-up charge of criminal cyber libel in the Philippines, Carol Cadwallader faces ongoing defamation action in the UK, which is being brought by one of the main subjects of her reporting that was connected to Cambridge Analytica and also connected to the Brexit battle. And so there are some similarities there which we should delve into a little more in conversation perhaps. But we could have picked women from any country in the world and found case studies like these because that's the nature of this abuse. What's really powerful, I think, is looking at the data as we've accumulated it in this report that we released for World Press Freedom Day, the chilling but also in another report, which I'll share with you in the chat, which looked specifically and in a much more detailed way at Maria. When you see the threats, the rape threats, the death threats, the threats against these women's family members, and you see the language that's being used, the ways in which it's being viralized and deployed by so-called respectable journalists to critique these women in some cases, is very powerful, I think. So I think perhaps it would be appropriate if I stopped talking at you now and we got to a conversation that will allow me to catch my breath and perhaps dig into some of this in more detail, and we can discuss some of the recommendations as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I can't see you, but I hope you're all still there and you haven't fallen asleep.
We are here. Thank you so much for this presentation. This is a landmark study of the ICFJ and UNESCO, 125 countries. You are right. Journalists are tired of service. Whenever researchers go, they don't want. So this is, I believe this is important, how to reach 900 or 700 respondents with a mixed methodologies, qualitative, quantitative, and big data. Provide us with important evidence to support the argument on that the violence towards female journalists around the globe is real and is important, and it's a topic that we should be answering, no? We should be solving. So we're going to, we'll have this dialogue with Dr. Catherine Andrews. That, as I said, she's the Vice Chancellor, I think is the right word, I don't know, of her university, and she's a historian and obviously an academic from specialized in political military career of Anastasio Bustamante. That was her dissertation, and she's and she's from the University also of San Andrews. And so please, Dr. Catherine Andrews.
Thanks, Yennué. I shall speak in English, as I hope it will be better, although I will apologize now for the fact that my English is really very much a Spanglishy type mix of idiom. I find it hard to separate both languages in my head these days. I wanted to start by asking you about the context of your study. I thought it was interesting that you started off telling us about all the different ways you thought about when you were organizing the new pivot towards a digital consultation, all the different protections that you felt necessary to put into place in order to protect your survey. And I think I think it would be useful as a starting point to discuss how this is kind of representative or symbolic of the whole study in itself, yeah, as far as I can see, in the sense that this is a question that is complicated by the fact of the presence of women. There's one thing to study violence against journalism, and this is it's a pressing problem here in Mexico, and is continuing to have a very strong impact in how the press works in our context. However, once you add the gender perspective to this kind of investigation, we find that, I'm putting words into your mouth, you find perhaps that the situation of women journalists is complicated by their social situation as women. And yes, I think the question would be there, if it's possible, to, when you're thinking about these you said you had to abandon having I can't remember, I wrote it down, effective solutions to the problem. Yes. And we all, and I have to confess to laughing when I heard that. Because precisely the problem that you seem to be dealing with is that we are, there is the first element of the context, which is general hostility towards women in public positions and occupying the public voice, is the first problem. And then the second problem is them as journalists. And I wondered how, and I'm getting to a question here. I wondered how
you're understanding it perfectly.
What was struck me is the first question I had, and you then answered it, was about who was sending the threats in the first place. And I wondered, and this is you identified, and you know the troll farms who organised and the instrumentalization of mobs on public. You also mentioned the people
partisan journalists as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm trying to get to the third. And what I wondered was how much of this abuse is received by from fellow journalists.
Yeah.
Or are you able to see that, in the sense that male journalists feel threatened by the presence of women in their field? And I'm thinking specifically here of the Kalwalidas example that you gave me. And I wondered how, if you could elaborate or talk to us a bit about that.
Definitely, and we have some data. I mean, everything that you've just said pretty much encapsulates the situation, which is that, you know, women, they are journalists. I mean, the big data case studies demonstrate to us that in both of those cases, those women are being targeted by people who want them to shut up. They want them to shut up because they're women speaking truth to very powerful men. But they also want them to shut up because those very powerful men risk being brought down by their investigative reporting. And so this is constantly, you know, in play. But look, just a sidebar, many of the journalists we interviewed talked about, they gave us anecdotal evidence of their male colleague on exactly the same beat, dealing with exactly the same sources, never experiencing online violence. I mean, it's important to have the data to show, to prove that what they are experiencing is real, but it came to us time and time and time again in testimony. I mean, there were really some quite high profile journalists doing incredible work investigating far-right extremism on the internet for their news outlets, who were giving away their bylines. So they were removing their name from stories and handing it to male journalists because the male journalists were not likely to get the same kinds of attacks that they were, and they couldn't withstand the psychological trauma and the risk to their families in many cases, including rape threats against their babies in 3 cases, that, you know, this is the necessary step to be able to continue to do journalism. You silence yourself, not just in the sense of self-censorship as we understand it in media studies, where you might pull back from exposing corruption because of the risk of attack, but also that you are pulling back to make yourself less visible generally to men and to journalism and to audiences. And I felt quite, as a journalist myself, who's been studying journalism now for quite some time, I found that still so very shocking. And these are, you know, and strangely, I found it more shocking to hear this from women in comparatively safe Western liberal democracies who began by saying things like, I know I'm not in Mexico, actual quotes, you know, I know I'm not in Mexico, which of course is regarded as the least safe place to practice journalism internationally, where there is a huge problem with femicide. Despite my limited knowledge, I at least know that much. And they were, you know, sitting in the US, sitting in Sweden, sitting in the UK, saying, I'm not in a war zone, I'm not in Mexico, but crying. And I'll say this very candidly, all but 2 of the journalists I interviewed, and I did many, many, many of these interviews, wept because it was the first time they had spoken or that they felt they'd been properly listened to in discussing these issues. So sorry, I've gone off on a tangent terribly already, but that's just to give you some context. So for me, this story about the research is a personal story, it's a visceral story, and it's so much bound up with the subject's experience. But as you said, it's not just the political actors, it's not just the disinformation networks, and they include foreign state actors, you know, the geopolitics of the situation is relevant, but they also include male journalists. And we certainly saw that with Carole Cadwalladr, but we saw it as well, particularly in the US, with the women journalists who dared to speak, ironically, about their experience of online violence. So when these women first started, our research subjects started sharing the first report we published in November and December last year, the data came out, they shared it. They got brutally trolled by male journalists, a couple of whom were quite prominent, who then did the dog whistling for the pile-on attack against these women. But let me give you some data. So I'm just looking through here to the section on triggers. Yes. So partisan news outlets, do I have data in there? I don't have data at hand. It was around about, if I remember correctly, well, while I'm talking, I'm going to go and try and dig out my data set here. But it was around about the 15 to 20% mark around the world of the percentage of women who identified members of rival news organizations, for example, trolling them, or members of their own newsroom. And a smaller percentage involved online violence, even being fueled by their managers or supervisors. So as we talk, I'll go and try and pull that data out so I can be more specific. But that's, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely part of the picture. So the platforms are the vectors. The main triggers, or the most worrying triggers for many of the journalists, are the political actors. But the news organizations themselves, and the misogyny and sexism that continue to be embedded within those cultures, are also part of the problem, not just in terms of failing to respond appropriately, but in terms of even fanning the attacks. And we see that with disinformation, which is another area of my research as well, that, you know, the politically aligned, the partisan networks, particularly on the right, will amplify disinformation. They almost, you know, are washing this disinformation, if you like, to try and make it more respectable for a mainstream audience. And we see that happening with online violence as well. Sorry, I'll stop there and I'll go hunt for my data.
Well, I shall take the opportunity to carry on with this part of the conversation. I think one of the things I would like to highlight there would be how advantageous this is for male journalists. That women have to take a step back, or that they become the bylines for work that other women do. And here we have yet another reason why it's so difficult to confront this type of violence, because precisely the function of this violence is to privilege men in social, in public settings or in private settings. Absolutely. And this is why this kind of research is so important. And I should have started by congratulating you on all the work you've done. I'm sorry, I was just too eager to get in and ask my questions.
It's fine.
But I mean, the putting a label and defending the use of violence, which I think was a very wise choice on your behalf as the word to use to describe this kind of behaviour, can go some way to addressing the situation. And this is where I'm getting to my second question, really, which has to do with the platforms in which this kind of abuse occurs, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, plus media organizations, bosses, and line managers, and the people who are around journalists who are female journalists who are receiving this kind of abuse. One of the ways of dealing with it is, of course, taking away the excuse of ignorance, which has been always the first line of defense. This doesn't happen to me, and so it can't be happening to you. Don't exaggerate. Don't make this up. You're just being hysterical. We can go on and on about how.
Now, there's a word that comes up in the big data.
Well, because don't get carried away. Nobody meant anything by it. You're just being I think the volume of your research allows you to question that narrative. I wondered if you could tell me about your hopes or expectations about how to go about the second part, which is to precisely show platforms and to show news organizations precisely how they are making hay out of the violence directed against women with their actions, and how this could be a way of leveraging your information, or how you see there's possibilities. Because from my perspective, it's the hardest one to deal with, is the fact that in order for any kind of anti-violence work to have any kind of effect, men have to stop. I'll have to realize that benefiting from it is morally questionable.
Yeah. And I would add to that trying to disqualify, minimize, or otherwise undermine women's accounts of their lived experience, and to discourage them from processing that in a way that causes it to be escalated or elevated or acted upon, is also really a part of the problem. While I have my data set open, let me just give you an answer to that other question, and then I'll come back to that point about how we lever action and how we actually confront the power brokers here, and the power brokers when it comes to platform capture, or the enabling role of the platforms. Who are the young men in charge? They're all young men, young American entrepreneurs. Anyway, we'll come back to that in a moment. So I have in front of me, and I don't know how public we are here. We haven't published this yet. So this is kind of for your information and for anybody who happens to be loitering. So this is the data breakdown for Latin America from the survey. And what we can see is that so 15% of the women respondents from Latin America identified a colleague who was either equal or subordinate as a top instigator of online violence. Around 8% said that a manager or supervisor filled that function. Rival media organization staff, 7%. And there was another sources and contacts, which we haven't really talked about, but which is a really significant source of harassment and abuse as well, was around 16%. So that's just for Latin America. Those are the groups of the numbers of women who are saying that among top instigators are these particular people. So let me go back to Zoom where I can see you again, and go back to the question that you were asking. Yes, I mean, this power, this extraordinary wealth as well, let's be clear, this is not just about sexism and misogyny and silencing to preserve a reputation or to avoid accountability, but it's also about profits and the efforts that the platforms have to go to effect change are not, frankly, that significant, but they are potentially costly. But how costly when you're Facebook and you're turning over 29 billion in profits? And, the consequences of you doing nothing include women journalists being persecuted, threatened, suffering psychological injury, and in some cases being attacked physically, being physically stalked, having to move around the country, as was the case with 7 of the women we interviewed, where they were living, to constantly move addresses, with disrupting their families, disrupting their work lives. And back to that other point you made about causing women to become more invisible. How was that in the original design plan for platforms that were allegedly about connecting us to one another and making us all feel a little happier about that connectivity we have to humanity? I mean, I'm getting sarcastic now because it beggars belief, but that is what we are. That is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the need to drag these young, highly successful, incredibly rich men kicking and screaming to the table to ensure that we have justice for women as they try to continue to work in online spaces that are now inevitable in terms of their daily work. Because why? Because the platforms arrived, and for journalists to do their job, particularly in the context of high-level connectivity, they had to produce journalism while occupying these spaces. And they were not just required to do so by their news organizations, they were enticed by the platforms who tied up distribution of news content in ways that are still being negotiated. So there is a lot to think about there, but it's all bound up with power, profit, and patriarchy. And I think one of the really important aspects of this work has actually been the fact that we have now had approaches, or I've had approaches from very senior people at two, I won't name them yet, it will become clear when the book comes out, but two of the main players, and an absolute rejection from one of them. And I'll leave it to you to guess where that stacks up. But the two organizations in the big tech community that made an attempt to get in touch very quickly after this was published did so through their burgeoning human rights teams who are trying to deal, with this problem. And I did get a sense, and this, I have a background as an investigative reporter, but I somehow still have faith in humanity. So I think my takeaway was that there was sincerity in these conversations, that there was a genuine waking up, and this had happened. Probably it had evolved over the past 18 months or so as women started really talking back on within the mainstream media, for example, and started daring to even write about their experiences, and doing that terribly womanly thing of speaking about their emotions. I mean, how uncomfortable is that for the men in charge? Speaking about how they felt and what it was like to live in fear that your baby was going to be raped by the paramilitary neo-Nazi who has been chased by the police. This is a case from Northern Ireland I'm sharing here, for the past 5 years, who is the one threatening to come and rape your baby at your grandmother's address, but that platform still does nothing to try to protect you. And when you speak about that, and you speak about it in ways that are so human, and you write about it in ways that are so affecting, that's pretty disconcerting for the men in charge. And it also, I think, is extremely empowering for the women who've been sitting in silence in the newsrooms, worried about speaking up, because when they do speak up, the risk that not only will they lose their byline for the sake of protecting themselves, because they are not just the prime targets, they're also forced to be the first responders to this crisis, but they will actually lose their jobs in the context of a pandemic. They won't. It's not just we will not get to be the war correspondent we thought we were born to be now, but also, can we keep our job? Because we're so much more dispensable, apparently, in the context of a pandemic. Sorry, you've really turned me into a ranter this afternoon, but I quite like that.
It's very interesting if I can pitch in the conversation.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's really great.
Uncorked me, uncorked the rage.
No, that's excellent. Well, not excellent, but if I might say, I am thinking about this silencing and invisibilization and discipline of women that you are mentioning, because it is a global problem. What I'm finding, I admire your research because it connects with mine. I'm also researching on female journalists in Mexico. And when I look into the online harassment, it certainly creates silencing and self-censorship and fear, obviously, of the journalist. And obviously it threatens the right to speech of women, and Mexican women, and is targeted to these journalists that are women that have voices in the public sphere and dare to think. So that's what they target, no? The women that create information, construct information, and create conversation in the public sphere and give information to society. So that's the principle, the main issue. And as you said before, yes, in Mexico we have a particular case study because we we have this patriarchal structure, consolidated patriarchal structure, and also this structure normalizes violence towards women in general, not only journalists or politicians, but in general women. One of the figures that we got today is that 11 women a day are assassinated. So we are a country riddled with femicides, and that's the main issue if you are looking into it more structurally. And the second issue, as you as well mentioned, is that Mexico is a hostile country for journalists, as Article 19, CPJ, Freedom House have research. We are one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be a journalist. So if we intertwine the gender condition and the journalist profession situation, in Mexico is difficult because we see cases that that newsrooms are not helping to the reporters to understand what is dangerous. In most of the cases, the reporters don't want to tell their editors that they are suffering online violence because they are ashamed. And when it's very grave situation, they started to tell when it's too late sometimes. So for example, in the northern region in Mexico, in Baja California, we have detected a special modus operandi that they have deep real videos and ultra real pornographic videos of reporters and editors of female reporters and editors, with the objective to create moral injury. And in a context such as Baja California, that is a Catholic context and conservative, the sexual moral is important for females. So they are not only discrediting their prestige as women, as journalists, but also as women. So the attacks go towards their bodies, towards their aesthetics, towards their tongue. The tongue is a very symbolic, iconic threat. I'm gonna cut your tongue. I'm gonna
stop you talking. I mean, it's
Yes, exactly. It's the talking, no? Because it's their voice. They're thinking what they are addressing. So that's delicate. And there is another case in Veracruz, for example, that they use memes for to threat as well, no? Memes in this case of
absolutely,
video, that
we saw that very much in our data as well. And Veracruz is one of the most deadly regions in Mexico, isn't it, for journalists? Yeah. And my understanding, sorry, I'm going to ask you questions now, but my understanding is that there are two cases. Well, we at least, the researcher looking at closely at Mexico, at least identified two cases where women journalists had been murdered with impunity, who had first been quite brutally targeted online. So, which is a trend that we're seeing internationally, and one that I fear is likely to be, particularly significant and deadly in a place like Mexico.
Yes, this is important because, the online violence moves towards offline violence, yes? But yes. Some interviews that I've done and that I've read, the journalists, they do not think that that digital security is important, because they are worried, they're more worried about the physical security and threats by drug cartels, politicians, etc. So and they think that virtual security is just a fantasy, or it's not as important as the everyday life. So yeah, that's another thing that we need to also address. So definitely. I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think is the significance of doing this kind of research, given that is the first time that we got this important data on digital violence towards women journalists in the world, and for example, in Latin America, that we don't have much research on journalism studies?
So sorry, what the question was, what do I think is the significance
of doing this research?
Yeah. Well, I'll let others decide how significant it is, but for me, it's very significant for two reasons. One, because, well, as a feminist journalist and scholar who has spent years either advocating in macho newsrooms in Australia for gender equality, you know, I come from another anecdote, but my background was as a broadcast journalist with the ABC, which is the equivalent of the BBC in Australia. It's the national public broadcaster. And I recall, you know, as a young journalist, getting hate mail from men who said that women's voices were too high-pitched and couldn't be heard over the sound of machinery, and so therefore should not be allowed on air. I mean, this is the context from which I come. You know, and it's also a culture which, you know, I certainly wouldn't want to compare it to Mexico, but femicide, domestic violence are incredibly prolific in that context. And so I have this background, and so therefore doing this research that for me gets to the heart of one of the worst trends I've seen in terms of threats to the livelihood, equal representation and participation of women in journalism, but moreover, the way in which this phenomenon escalates the risk of psychological injury, physical injury, all of which is tied up, as you rightly point out, with poor digital security practice. But again, every time we talk about this, and we need to keep ensuring that there are appropriate skills and tools to allow women to defend themselves as best they can, we're still, just as we are with sexual assault and domestic violence, saying, it's on you, women. You must protect yourself. You must conceal, you must withdraw, you must, you know, defend, put up barriers and so on. And I know we'll never get to a point where we can say that those things do not have to be done, because self-defense is obviously important. But I think with this problem, we have the power to at least try to shift it through insistence on accountability of the platforms that enable this violence to spread with potentially devastating and deadly consequences, by, instead of requiring the women to be the ones defending themselves by blocking, muting, reporting, deleting, complaining to a vacuum where nothing ever gets done, which is the absolute kind of, you know, generalized experience. We need to get to a point where they are redesigning, where they are, you know, through technical and points of human redesign, putting human rights at the center of their operation and investing in, you know, methods that allow the curtailment of that speech while respecting international freedom of expression rights and protections, acknowledging that sexism and misogyny are forms of hate speech. And there's work to be done in states for this to be recognized too, so that when the regulation that we know is coming with regards to the platforms, it's not just racism and homophobia and transphobia that are addressed, but also misogyny and sexism as forms of hate speech, because we can start to see that there will be an attempt to prosecute hate speech, even though these companies are based in the US and they see themselves as being protected by the First Amendment, which very problematically is interpreted as some kind of free ride for unfettered speech of all kinds, rather than a goal which has to be upheld in the context of protecting others' speech capacity, including marginalized people, especially marginalized people, and just people who face multitudes of discrimination. So we need to work on two fronts. We need to work with the power structures within the state apparatus and within the power structures of US-based corporations to ensure that the moderation and you know, responses to online violence are actually reflective of the reality that gender-based crimes are a product of, in part at least, of hate speech that is, you know, misogynistic and sexist. Sorry, that was very long-winded. Hopefully you see my point. And, you know, the thing is that while we might not get change of the kind we would like to see in very patriarchal societies, you know, in India, for example, you know, we may not get legislative responses that recognize and prioritize the protection of women from hate crimes. We can hope, and we should hope and expect, that those people who control the levers that give these men platforms to do the work that they're doing to cut women down are able to, you know, provide some kind of mechanisms within all of the countries, within all of the languages that they operate. And I think that's a very important point, because so many women in parts of the world where the physical risk is so extreme can't even get through to report rape and death threats that are credible because of a language barrier, you know, let alone talking about minority languages in countries in places that, say, Facebook or Twitter think are far-flung.
Yeah, internet governance is important, or well, in Mexico, the lack of internet governance.
Yes.
And the political economy, of course, and the precarity of work in the newsrooms in general in Mexico, plus the COVID-19 and the violence, domestic violence that we've seen in this year. So I think we'll have a time for a question of our director of our journalism program, Grisel.
Thank you. I know that we are running out of time, but I think we need to reflect on the fact that the political environment is very related with this problem, this situation. So I was very curious about the trends that you are finding in your research about the populism and the aggressions against women, because here in Mexico, the feminist movement is one of the strongest opposition forces in this context. I mean, our president is always attacking media and other political groups, but definitely one of the strongest social forces here has been the feminist organization. So I am curious if the aggressions against journalists are related with corruption or this kind of research, or maybe these women are attacked because of their feminist inclination or...
Yeah. Well, I can't give you the data breakdown for Mexico because we haven't gotten that granular yet, but I can certainly tell you that globally, we see that the round, the beat, the theme that is most likely to lead to large-scale and very vicious attacks is reporting on gender. Of course, that doesn't just mean reporting on feminism or feminist cultures. It means also reporting on things like, you know, trans issues, but it includes reproductive rights, you know, issues which in particularly conservative Catholic countries from Latin America through to Poland, for example, we see those sorts of issues that journalists are reporting on being real triggers for online attacks. So it's absolutely connected to the kind of reporting or the kind of philosophy behind the reporting, which includes feminists. And, you know, the abuse that the identifiably feminist women who are involved in our study get is very clearly about a response to the fact that they are speaking about their rights, that they are raising their voices, and that they are challenging patriarchy. You know, even to just an example from Carol Cadwallader, which you'll find. Actually, will you share with the group the various reports that we've done, because people can then go through the big data case studies. One of the reports is already in Spanish. That's the first study that we released, which was based on the survey. But in the Carol Cadwallader case study, she gets abuse which is repeated over and over again. And I don't know if this is going to be easily understood outside of an English context, but the man who is suing her currently for defamation for her reporting, and this goes to the question of, is it about corruption? Yes, it is. It's about reporting on corruption, reporting on powerful figures, but it's also about reporting on the issues. But the abuse that she gets from this man is frequently things like, oh, you wouldn't be so lippy if you lived in Russia. Lippy is an expression which means you like the tongue. You know, you talk a lot. Yeah, exactly. You go off, and you give lip. You're aggressive in the way you speak. You wouldn't be so lippy if you lived in Russia. In other words, you know, if you lived somewhere where you'd be killed for your work, you'd be quiet. And that's, you know, that's a typically kind of misogynistic, you know, shut up woman. You know, you're speaking about not just things that I don't want you to speak about because of the, you know, the potential damage to my reputation, which is what the defamation action is about, but also because you're a woman and you shouldn't be saying these things, and because you talk about them like a feminist. So I think, yes, all of these things are bound up. You report on feminist issues, you're a target. You report on non-traditional issues that are considered to be non-traditionally female. So if you're reporting on business, technology, politics, you know, sometimes crime, you're seen not to be outside of your narrow kind of field, then in some countries that is even a trigger for attack. In parts like Nigeria, for example, where, you know, there's an expectation that women journalists stick to the soft topics rather than, and so even that is seen as some kind of feminist act if you're actually pursuing stories that are outside of those norms of, you know, as Germans say, the kitchen and the cooking. So yeah, so all of those things are evident and very real. But I think it is telling that you are more likely to get attacked if you report on issues of femicide, domestic violence, reproductive rights. What else did we include in that list? Gender-based violence broadly, sexual assault. These are among the top triggers.
Yeah, that could be like the third trigger: gender in Mexico, hostile country, and reporting femicide. And yeah, we have we have several questions from the audience, but we'll just have time for two. Would that be okay?
Yes, I'm happy to. Sorry, I've talked so much that you should let people speak.
And we have a question of Sirenia Celestino. She's part of CIMAC, an NGO, Mexican NGO that works on gender journalism. And she asked, what elements would you consider are fundamental? Sorry, I'm translating and I'm very bad translator. Are fundamentals for the protection of women journalists, and then the safe return for the exiled journalists or displaced journalists. I don't know if I phrase it correctly.
Okay. So in terms of addressing this problem, you know, there are many things that need to be done, and I'd encourage people to dig into the recommendations from this last report, which begin to outline how we think this problem could be tackled in a holistic way. But from an NGO perspective, I think working with researchers to document in the ways that we've started to document the scale and the ferocity of these attacks can be an effective form of advocacy, because as several of you have pointed out, being able to show to legislators, to show to policymakers, to show to UN actors, this is how serious it is. These are the kinds of threats that were received. These are how many times and how many ways they entered the intimate environs of this woman's life. And these are how they're interconnected. And here are the political actors who are behind this. I mean, to be able to provide that evidence, just as any large-scale investigative journalism project should try to do, it gives you a platform from which to advocate for change. Because it's just been far too easy to say this is all in the woman's head. it's not real. Even if it is threatening her mental health, it's not real because it's not physical. So this is, I think, an important way, and it might be perceived to be a quite masculinist way. Give them the data. There's clear facts. There's nothing emotional here, but it is terribly emotional because it's just data that reflects lived experience. So that is important. It's really important, as you suggested, to support and strengthen holistic defensive training and resources. So, many news organizations around the world and specialist NGOs that work in the area of journalism safety are very expert at providing advice on physical security in an analog or offline world. Many of us who've worked in large news organizations and have reported on disasters or wars have been to hostile environment training. Well, the hostile environment is now not out there. It's in our inboxes, on our phone apps, buzzing morning, noon and night, threatening us. And we need to be able to, as my friend and colleague Hannah Storm talks about, be equipped with like a digital and emotional flak jacket. So again, I don't want to put too much of an emphasis on the responsibility of the women to equip themselves this way, but we need access to the tools, whether that's digital security tools and the psychological support and the editorial support to recognize which stories, which sources, and what periods of time are likely to result in an increased risk of online violence. So bringing that all together through both training and holistic policies that try to bridge psychological support, digital safety and security, and physical safety and security, and integrate them. I mean, I can't tell you the number of news organizations that still have the man, and it usually is the man, ex-military, who deals with security for the news organization and the newsroom, who hasn't got a clue, what to do with the social media. It's like you have to be able to, which is not necessarily their fault, but it's the fault of the managerial kind of structures at the top that don't see that this dot now needs to be linked to this dot. Otherwise, the woman is exceedingly vulnerable on this side, whereas she might have decent physical security on that side. So I think, from a newsroom point of view, that still is the most important thing, as is providing the support and encouragement for women to come forward and to feel that they will not be punished or downgraded for daring to speak about it. Then there's the whole question of, the political situation, and we're starting to see in some parts of the world moves towards sanctions against politicians by political parties for targeted online violence, for example. So that is something that certain political parties could try to introduce, but we also need, really importantly, legislative responses to dealing with this problem that are focused on regulating or at least enforcing standards on the platforms themselves. And until that happens, there's no way that we can keep swatting, the abusers away. It's just now at such a scale that, we have no hope of effective measures, in response beyond that.
I agree. And also education, training.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Journalists, and also the solidarity, the peer solidarity, the journalist guilds.
Yeah. International networking too has been identified by many of the women we interviewed, particularly in parts of the world where they can't get through because of they're not Anglophone countries. They can't get through to the platforms or to, to leverage responses that might be more effective. So I think that the sort of opportunity for a global kind of solidarity among journalists and their allies, academics, civil society, and so on, is really important as a way of ensuring that this particular issue gets the attention that it needs.
Totally. We are starting this experiment in Mexico alliance between academics, civil society, and journalists in order to protect them. And Grisel and I, we are part of the network. So, so we're starting to see what is happening. And we would love to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, the time is our enemy. And so many of the questions from the audience, I believe have been already answered by you. So in any case, we can send the topic to you in an email.
Yes, that would be great if you can send me the questions. And I would also, you know, very much welcome input from people who are in the audience who are studying this issue, particularly around Mexico. And I will follow up, if you don't mind, with a couple of questions for you about the way in which we're what we're learning and the way in which we're framing it in reference to Mexico, particularly for this study. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It's actually been, despite the topic, a really invigorating conversation for me, and I'm completely exhausted. So the fact that you've made me feel feisty and alive is a very good thing.
You have been amazing. Thank you so much. And I just want to quote you that you finished your keynote in Oslo saying it is time to research on female journalists and the time is now. And that invigorated my research, so I have to thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Catherine Andrews, and also our translator, Ana Luisa Martinez, and our team, the PeriodismoCIDE team, Dr. Grisel Salazar, Brenda Valdez, and Kenia Perez, and all of you to thank you for coming and to reflect in community with us. And I believe this is the start of a conversation about female journalists, and particularly in Mexico, and the importance that this topic has, and to make it visible and to demand for more protection. So thank you so much. Gracias.
Thank you, everyone. Gracias indeed, and yeah, solidarity and strength. Everybody there working in such difficult circumstances to practice journalism and to study journalism. We just look at you with a degree of awe. That is the sort of stamina we need.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Posetti.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.